I pushed through the heavy glass doors into the cool Chicago evening and finally let myself breathe. The city stretched out around me, millions of lights beginning to twinkle in the dusk. Somewhere in those lights were other women like me, women who'd just discovered that their lives weren't what they thought they were. But as I stood there on the sidewalk, watching taxis cruise past and couples walking hand in hand toward their own dinner reservations, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't devastated. I wasn't even really sad. I was furious, yes. Hurt, absolutely. But underneath all of that was something I hadn't felt in years: relief. The constant low-level anxiety I'd been carrying, the feeling that I was somehow failing at being a wife, the nagging sense that I was losing myself in someone else's ambitions, all of it was lifting like fog burned away by sunlight. For 15 years, I'd been Emma Carter, David's wife. I'd shaped my entire identity around supporting his career, managing his life, being the perfect partner for a man climbing the ladder at one of Chicago's most prestigious law firms. I'd put my own dreams on hold so many times I'd almost forgotten what they were. But before I became David's wife, I'd been Emma Richardson, the girl who'd graduated summa cum laude from Northwestern with a degree in finance and real estate development. The woman who'd written her thesis on urban investment strategies and commercial property acquisition. The same woman who'd spent the last 10 years quietly building something David knew nothing about. My phone buzzed in my purse. A text from David: "Emma, please come home so we can talk about this like adults." I deleted it without responding and kept walking. 3 blocks later, my phone rang. This time it was a call from Rachel Martinez, my best friend since college and the only person who knew all my secrets. "Emma? I just got your text. Are you okay? Where are you?" "I'm walking through downtown, and I'm actually okay. Better than okay, I think." "What happened?" "Your message just said it's over and call me later." I found myself smiling, really. Smiling, for the first time in months. Remember that conversation we had last year about what we'd do if we ever got the chance to start over? "You mean when we were drunk on my couch eating ice cream and planning our revenge fantasies against our exes?" "Those weren't fantasies, Rachel. At least, not all of them." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Rachel knew me well enough to hear something different in my voice. "Emma, what did you do?" "Nothing yet," I said, stopping at a red light and watching the stream of evening commuters hurrying past. "But I'm about to become very, very busy." The light changed, and I crossed the street toward the towering glass and steel structure that dominated this block of downtown Chicago. The Metropolitan Towers, 42 stories of luxury apartments and penthouses, home to some of the city's most successful professionals. Including, I happen to know, at least 6 partners from David's law firm and their families. I stood on the sidewalk looking up at the building, at the lights glowing in windows where people were settling in for the evening, making dinner, helping kids with homework, living the kind of comfortable, secure lives that money and success were supposed to guarantee. My phone buzzed again. Another text from David: "Madison left. I'm coming home. We need to talk." This time I did respond, but not to David. I opened a new message and typed, "Jake, it's Emma. Are you working tonight? I need to access the building. It's time." The response came back within seconds: "Been waiting for this day, Mrs. C. I'll be at the back entrance in 10 minutes. I slipped my phone back into my purse and started walking toward the service entrance of the Metropolitan Towers. It was time for David to learn exactly who he'd been married to for the past 15 years. And more importantly, it was time for him to find out what he'd just lost. Because while David had been building his career and apparently his relationship with Madison, I'd been building something else entirely. Something he was about to become very, very familiar with. The security camera above the service door blinked its red recording light as I approached, and I found myself wondering if David was home yet, if he was pacing our living room wondering where I was, if it had occurred to him yet that this might not go the way he'd planned. Jake opened the door before I could knock, his weathered face creasing into a grin that held 15 years of shared secrets. "Evening, boss," he said quietly. "Ready to rock their world?" I stepped into the service corridor of the building I'd owned for the past 3 years, the building where my cheating husband and half his law firm lived in blissful ignorance, and smiled back. "More than ready, Jake. More than ready." The service elevator hummed quietly as Jake and I rode up to the 38th floor, the floors ticking by in green digital numbers that seemed to mark the countdown to David's reckoning. Jake had been the building's head of maintenance since before I'd purchased the Metropolitan Towers, and he was one of the few people who knew that the mysterious E.R.F. Holdings company that owned the building was actually Emma Richardson Holdings, my maiden name carefully preserved for business purposes. "Mr. Carter came in about an hour ago," Jake said, checking his tablet for the building's security logs. "Looked agitated." Mrs. Patterson from 3205 stopped him in the lobby, wanted to chat about the new gym equipment, and he practically ran to the elevator. I wasn't surprised. David hated small talk with neighbors, especially when he was stressed. He probably assumed I'd gone home to pack my bags or call a divorce lawyer, maybe both. He had no idea that I was currently standing in the service area of the building he called home, reviewing maintenance reports for properties he didn't know I owned. What about Madison Wells? Has she been here recently? Jake's expression darkened. Slightly. Oh yes. She's been a regular visitor for the past few months. Always after 9 p.m., always leaves before 6 a.m. Real discreet-like. Mr. Carter probably thought none of the staff would notice, but we notice everything in a building like this. The elevator stopped at 38, and Jake led me down. A carpeted hallway lined with expensive artwork and indirect lighting. The Metropolitan Towers catered to Chicago's elite, and every detail was designed to whisper wealth and exclusivity, which made what I was about to do even more satisfying. Building's been good to you, Mrs. C, Jake said as we walked. Occupancy rate at 98%, minimal complaints, waiting list longer than my arm. You picked a winner when you bought this place. He was right. The Metropolitan Towers had been my crown jewel acquisition, purchased through a series of shell companies and private investors 3 years ago when the previous owner got caught in a tax scandal. David had been so busy with a high-profile merger case that he'd barely noticed when I'd suddenly become very interested in urban development, conferences and property management seminars. We stopped at the service door that led to the main hallway where David's apartment was located. Through the small window, I could see the familiar burgundy carpeting and gold-trimmed walls that David loved because they reminded him of his grandfather's gentleman's club. You sure about this timing? Jake asked, checking his watch. Might be better to wait until morning, catch him off guard. The champagne flute slipped from my fingers, crystal shattering against the marble floor of Le Bernardin as I watched my husband of 15 years lean across the table to kiss another woman. Not just any woman. Madison Wells, his 28-year-old secretary with her perfectly blown-out blonde hair and that red dress I'd helped him pick out for her last Christmas bonus shopping trip. The same dress he'd said would look stunning on someone with her figure. The sound of breaking glass made other diners turn, their curious eyes landing on me standing frozen between the bar and the dining room. David's head snapped up, his face draining of color as our eyes met across the restaurant. Madison followed his gaze, and when she saw me, she didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. Instead, she smiled that practiced smile she'd perfected in client meetings, the one that said she was exactly where she wanted to be. My legs felt like they might give out. 15 years. 15 years of building a life together, of supporting his career when he was just another struggling associate working 80-hour weeks, of postponing my own dreams so he could chase his partnership. 15 years of being the perfect lawyer's wife, hosting dinner parties for his colleagues, remembering their wives' names and their children's birthdays, making sure his dry cleaning was picked up and his mother got called on Sundays. David stood up slowly, his 6-foot frame looking smaller somehow in his tailored navy suit. The same suit I'd surprised him with for his 40th birthday last month. He took a step toward me, his mouth opening like he was going to say something. Anything that could possibly explain what I was seeing. But before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The waiter appeared beside me with a towel, quietly cleaning up the shattered glass while pretending not to notice the domestic drama unfolding in his section. I wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor with the champagne and crystal fragments. But something inside me refused to run. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was shock, but I stood there watching my husband fumble for words while his mistress sat back in her chair like she was enjoying the show. Emma, David finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. This isn't what it looks like. The laugh that escaped my throat was sharp and bitter. Really? Because it looks like you're having a romantic dinner with your secretary while I'm at home waiting for you to come back from your business trip to Philadelphia. The business trip that apparently ended 3 days ago, according to the GPS on your company car. Madison's smile faltered for just a moment. She hadn't expected that. Neither had David, judging by the way his Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. You've been tracking me? He asked, and there was something in his voice that almost sounded like relief, like being caught was better than continuing to lie. I've been married to you for 15 years, David. I know when you're lying. I kept my voice steady, even though my heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I was sure the entire restaurant could hear it. What I don't know is how long this has been going on. Madison reached for her wine glass, taking a slow sip like she was savoring both the vintage and the moment. 6 months, she said, her voice honey-sweet with just a hint of satisfaction. Since the Morrison case wrapped up. 6 months. 6 months of David coming home late, claiming he was buried in paperwork. 6 months of him being too tired for our weekend walks around Lincoln Park, too stressed for our Thursday date nights, too busy for the conversations that used to stretch late into the night when we first moved to Chicago. 6 months of me wondering what I'd done wrong, what I could do better, how I could be more supportive of his demanding career. Madison, David hissed, finally showing some emotion that wasn't panic or guilt. What? She shrugged, setting down her glass. She deserves to know. Besides, we talked about this. About being honest when the time came. When the time came. Like my marriage was just a schedule conflict they needed to work around. I looked at David, really looked at him, and saw a stranger. The man I'd met in law school had been passionate. About justice, about fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves. He'd wanted to do public interest work, to make a difference. Somewhere along the way, that idealistic young man had been replaced by someone who measured success in billable hours and partnership percentages. Someone who could sit in a 5-star restaurant with his secretary while his wife waited at home with dinner growing cold. How long have you been planning to tell me? I asked, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. David's shoulders sagged. Emma, I never wanted it to happen like this. I've been trying to figure out how to what? How to ask for a divorce. Without losing half your assets? How to spin this so you don't look like the cliché of every other middle-aged lawyer who trades in his wife for a younger model. The words hung in the air between us like smoke. Other diners were definitely watching now, their conversations muted as they strained to catch our drama. I could feel their eyes on my back, could imagine them whispering to their companions about the poor woman who'd just discovered her husband's affair in public. But something strange was happening inside me. The initial shock was wearing off, replaced by something cleaner, sharper. Anger, yes, but not the messy, emotional kind that would leave me sobbing in restaurant bathrooms. This was different. This was the kind of anger that clarified everything, that stripped away years of self-doubt and people-pleasing and revealed what was really underneath. You know what the funny thing is? I said, picking up my purse from where I dropped it when the glass fell. I actually came here to surprise you. I saw your location on Find My Friends and thought I'd join you for dinner, maybe rekindle some of that romance we've been missing lately. Madison's perfectly applied lipstick couldn't hide the slight smirk that crossed her face. I'm glad I did, I continued. Because now I don't have to wonder anymore why you've been so distant, why you stopped touching me, why you look right through me when I talk about my day. I don't have to keep trying to fix something that was already broken. David reached out like he was going to touch my arm, but I stepped back. Emma, please. Can we talk about this at home? In private? Private. I looked around the restaurant, at the faces trying not to stare, at the waitstaff pretending to be busy while clearly listening. You chose this, David. You chose to have your affair in public, to flaunt it around your colleagues, to bring her to the same places we used to go together. The Gibson Steakhouse last Tuesday, wasn't it? And Morton's the week before? I saw the credit card statements. His face went white. You've been going through my credit cards? There are credit cards, David. Joint accounts, remember? The ones I've been managing for the past 5 years while you've been too busy to balance a checkbook. I slung my purse over my shoulder, feeling strangely light despite the weight of what had just happened. But don't worry. You won't have to worry about joint anything much longer. I turned to leave, then paused, looking back at Madison. She was younger than me, prettier in that polished, professional way that came from having someone else pay for your gym membership and salon appointments. But there was something in her eyes that looked almost hungry, like she was feeding off the pain she was causing. Enjoy it while it lasts, I told her quietly. But remember, if he'll cheat with you, he'll cheat on you. Madison's smile finally disappeared completely. I walked out of Le Bernardin with my head high, my heels clicking against the marble floor with steady, measured steps. I didn't run, didn't cry, didn't look back. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I shook my head. He's expecting me to come home crying, ready to beg for explanations or forgiveness. He's probably already planning his speech about how it just happened, how he never meant to hurt me, how we can work through this if I'm willing to be reasonable. My phone had been buzzing constantly for the past hour. David's texts had evolved from demanding to pleading to angry and back to pleading again. The last one, sent 10 minutes ago, read, Emma, I know you're upset. But running away won't solve anything. Come home so we can talk like the adults we are. Adults. As if I was the one being childish for objecting to my husband's 6-month affair with his secretary. I want him off balance, I continued. I want him confused about why I'm not responding to his messages, why I'm not home falling apart like he expects. Because in about 12 hours, Mr. David Carter is going to get a very official letter that's going to change his entire perspective on our marriage. Jake grinned. You really thought this through, didn't you? Jake, I've been planning for this possibility since the day I realized David saw me as an accessory to his career instead of an equal partner. I just never thought I'd actually need to use those plans. That wasn't entirely true. Deep down, I'd known for at least 2 years that David was pulling away from me, from us. He'd stopped asking about my day, stopped sharing details about his work, stopped looking at me the way he used to when we were young and broke and dreaming about the future together. But I'd told myself it was just the stress of his career, the pressure of making partner, the natural evolution of a long marriage. I'd been wrong. It was simpler and more devastating than that. David had just stopped loving me. But while I'd been trying to save our marriage, I'd also been protecting myself. The real estate portfolio I'd built over the past decade wasn't just a hobby or a side project. It was insurance. It was independence. It was power that David had no idea existed. Mrs. C, can I ask you something? Jake said as we prepared to enter the main hallway. Of course. Why didn't you ever tell him? About the buildings, the business, all of it? Seems like something a husband should know. I considered the question as I straightened my jacket and checked my reflection in the polished surface of a nearby fire extinguisher case. Because the moment I told David I owned real estate worth more than his annual salary, our marriage would have changed completely. Either he would have felt threatened and tried to control my business, or he would have seen me as a business opportunity instead of his wife. And now? Now our marriage is over anyway, and he's about to find out exactly what he's been taking for granted. I pushed open the service door and stepped into the main hallway of the 38th floor. The carpet was thick enough to muffle footsteps, and the walls were painted in that particular shade of cream that was supposed to be both elegant and timeless. 8 apartments on this floor, each one a testament to Chicago's legal and financial elite. David's apartment, 3804, was at the end of the hall, corner unit with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan. When we'd first moved in 5 years ago, he'd been so proud of the address, the prestige, the fact that he could afford to live in the same building as federal judges and Fortune 500 CEOs. He'd never asked how we'd qualified for the apartment so quickly, despite the legendary waiting list. He'd never questioned why our rent was slightly lower than comparable units in the building. He'd just assumed it was his charm and credentials that had impressed the mysterious property management company. I stood outside our apartment door, listening to the familiar sounds from inside. The television was on, tuned to the financial news channel David always watched before bed. I could hear him moving around, probably pacing between the living room and kitchen the way he did when he was agitated. My key still worked, of course. I was still his wife, still legally entitled to access our shared residence. But instead of using it, I knocked. The sounds inside stopped immediately. Footsteps approached the door, and I could picture David looking through the peephole, confusion and relief warring on his face. The door swung open, and there he was. David Carter, 42 years old, 6 feet tall, still handsome in that polished, professional way that had first attracted me in law school. His dark hair was disheveled like he'd been running his hands through it, and his shirt was wrinkled from where he'd loosened his tie. Emma. His voice held a mixture of relief and wariness. Thank God. I was starting to worry that you'd done something drastic. Drastic? I stepped into the apartment, noting how he automatically moved aside to let me pass. Even in crisis, David defaulted to good manners. Like what? Throw myself into Lake Michigan over a cheating husband? The apartment looked exactly the same as it had this morning when I'd left for my yoga class, completely unaware that my marriage was already over. The leather furniture David had insisted on, the abstract art that was supposed to be sophisticated, the view of the lake that had seemed so romantic when we'd first moved in. Now it all felt like stage dressing for a play I was no longer interested in performing. Emma, please sit down. Let me explain what happened tonight. Let me explain everything. I remained standing, my purse still over my shoulder like I might leave at any moment. Which, honestly, I might. I'm listening. David ran his hand through his hair again, a nervous habit I'd learned to recognize over 15 years of marriage. It started innocently enough. Madison and I were working late on the Morrison case. You remember how complex that acquisition was. She was putting in 16-hour days, really going above and beyond. And you were so grateful for her dedication that you decided to sleep with her. It wasn't like that. David's voice rose slightly, then he caught himself and lowered it again. Emma, you have to understand, we've been growing apart for years. You've been so focused on your own interests, your classes and your investment clubs and all those weekend seminars you attend. My investment clubs. My weekend seminars. David had always dismissed my business activities as hobbies, even when they started generating serious income. Even when I'd tried to share my excitement about successful property acquisitions or profitable renovations, he'd listen with the same polite attention he gave to dinner party conversations about wine or vacation plans. So you're saying this is my fault because I have interests outside of our marriage? No, that's not what I'm saying. David sat down heavily on the couch, looking suddenly exhausted. I'm saying we've become strangers living in the same apartment. When was the last time we had a real conversation? When was the last time we talked about something other than schedules and logistics? He wasn't entirely wrong, and that stung more than I wanted to admit. We had become roommates more than spouses, coordinating calendars and splitting household responsibilities with efficient politeness. But that didn't excuse what he'd done. So instead of talking to me about feeling disconnected, you decided to connect with your secretary instead. Emma, Madison understands the pressures of my work. She gets excited about the cases I'm working on, asks intelligent questions about legal strategy. She makes me feel like the man I used to be. The man he used to be. I almost laughed at that. The man David used to be had cared about justice and fairness and making a difference in the world. The man sitting in front of me now cared about billable hours and partnership tracks and impressing clients with expensive dinners. And what about the woman I used to be, David? Do you even remember her? He looked up at me, and for a moment I saw genuine confusion in his eyes. What do you mean? I mean the woman you met in law school. Who was going to change the world through urban development. The woman who wrote her thesis on affordable housing strategies and commercial revitalization. The woman who had dreams and ambitions that had nothing to do with being someone's wife. Emma, you gave up those dreams because you chose to support my career. That was a decision we made together. No, David. That was a decision you made and I went along with because I loved you and believed we were building something together. But apparently, we were just building your life while mine got smaller and smaller. I walked to the window, looking out at the city lights reflected on Lake Michigan. Somewhere out there were the other properties I owned, the apartment buildings. And office complexes and retail spaces that represented the dream I'd never actually given up, just pursued quietly. Emma, I know I've hurt you terribly. I know what I did was wrong. But people make mistakes, even good people. Even people who love each other. I turned back to face him. Do you love me, David? The question hung in the air between us. David opened his mouth, then closed it again. He looked down at his hands, then back up at me. I love the life we've built together, he said finally. That's not what I asked. Another long pause. David had always been good with words, skilled at finding the right phrases to persuade judges and juries. But apparently, he couldn't find the words to lie to his wife about something this fundamental. I don't know, he admitted quietly. I thought I did, but these past few months with Madison, feeling alive again, feeling passionate about someone. I don't know if what we have is love or just habit. At least he was being honest. Finally. Thank you for telling me the truth. I said, and I meant it. That's the first real thing you've said to me in months. My phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced at it quickly, then smiled. What is it? David asked. Just Rachel, checking on me. I put my phone away and picked up my purse. I should go. Go where? Emma, this is your home too. We need to figure out how to move forward from here. I paused at the door, my hand on the handle. David, do you remember when we first moved into this building? You were so excited about the prestige, about living in the same complex as all those successful people. Of course. It was a big step up for us. Do you remember how we got approved so quickly, despite the waiting list? David frowned. I assumed it was because of my credentials, my references from the firm. And you never wondered why our rent was lower than comparable units? Why we got upgraded to a corner apartment even though we'd applied for a standard one bedroom? I figured we got lucky. Right place, right time. I opened the door, then looked back at him one more time. David, you're about to learn that luck had nothing to do with it. And neither did your credentials. I left him sitting on the couch, confusion written across his face, and walked back down the hallway toward the service elevator. Jake was waiting for me, along with a young woman I didn't recognize. Mrs. C, this is Sarah Chen, our new night security supervisor. Sarah, this is the building owner I told you about. Sarah's eyes widened slightly. Ma'am, it's an honor to meet you. Jake's told me a lot about your leadership style. Just treat the residents with respect and keep the building secure, I said. That's all any of us can do. As we rode down in the service elevator, Jake cleared his throat. So, what's the plan for tomorrow? I checked my watch. It was almost 11 p.m., which meant it was morning in London, where my attorney was probably already at his desk preparing the documents I'd requested 6 months ago, just in case I ever needed them. Tomorrow, Mr. Carter gets a very official notification that his lease is being terminated due to violation of building policies regarding overnight guests. He'll have 30 days to vacate the premises. And his law firm colleagues who live here? Oh, they'll be getting their own letters very soon. Turns out there have been some noise complaints, some issues with building protocol violations. Nothing personal, of course. Just business. Jake whistled low. Remind me never to. Get on your bad side, Mrs. C. Just remember, Jake. David Carter chose to end our marriage the moment he started bringing his mistress to our home. I'm just making sure he understands the full consequences of that choice. The elevator reached the ground floor, and I stepped out into the marble lobby of the Metropolitan Towers. In a few hours, the morning shift would arrive, and the building would begin its daily rhythm of successful people heading off to their important jobs, secure in their expensive apartments and comfortable lives. But for some of those residents, tomorrow was going to bring a very unpleasant surprise. And for David Carter, it was going to be the beginning of a very expensive education about exactly who he'd been married to for the past 15 years. I walked out into the Chicago night, my heels echoing off the sidewalk, and for the first time in months, I felt like myself again. Not David's wife, not the perfect lawyer's spouse, not the woman trying desperately to save a marriage that had already ended. Just Emma. Emma Richardson, successful businesswoman, property owner, and soon-to-be ex-wife. And tomorrow, David was going to find out exactly what that meant. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse office, casting long shadows across the mahogany conference table where 27 legal documents were arranged in perfect rows. Each document represented a different property in my portfolio, and each one was about to become a very expensive problem for my soon-to-be ex-husband and his colleagues. Rachel Martinez sat across from me, her laptop open and her expression a mixture of admiration and concern. As my business partner and closest friend, she'd been instrumental in building E.R. Holdings from a single duplex investment into a real estate empire worth $43 million. She'd also been the one person who'd consistently warned me that keeping my business secret from David would eventually backfire. Emma, are you absolutely sure about this? Rachel asked, gesturing toward the documents. Once we serve these eviction notices, there's no going back. David will know everything. I picked up the first document, a lease termination notice. For apartment 3804 at the Metropolitan Towers. David's signature was clearly visible on the original lease agreement, along with his employment verification from Sterling and Associates and 3 character references. What wasn't visible was the fact that his landlord was his wife. Rachel. David made his choice when he decided to bring Madison Wells into our home. He violated his lease agreement, he violated our marriage, and he violated 15 years of trust. The fact that he doesn't know I own the building just makes it more satisfying. My phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail, then checked the message. It was from Richard Harrison, senior partner at Sterling and Associates and David's boss. Mrs. Carter, this is Richard Harrison. I hope you'll forgive the early call, but I wanted to reach out personally about the situation with David and Miss Wells. Perhaps we could meet for coffee this morning to discuss how the firm might help facilitate a discreet resolution to this unfortunate matter. I deleted the message without bothering to respond. Richard Harrison had no idea that his own luxury condo on Michigan Avenue was also part of my portfolio, purchased through a subsidiary company 18 months ago when the previous owners defaulted on their mortgage. Was that another call from David? Rachel asked. No, that was his boss trying to do damage control. Apparently, word about last night's restaurant scene has already reached the partners at Sterling and Associates. Rachel raised an eyebrow. That was fast. Madison Wells isn't exactly known for her discretion. She probably called half the firm before she even left Le Bernardin last night. I stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the bustling streets of downtown Chicago. But that actually works in our favor. The more people who know about the affair, the less David can control the narrative. My assistant knocked on the door and entered with a silver tray containing coffee and the morning's mail. Jennifer had been with E.R. Holdings for 3 years, and she was one of the few people who knew about my connection to David Carter. She'd also been the one to alert me 6 months ago when Madison Wells had started appearing regularly in the building's security footage. Mrs. Richardson, the documents from London arrived by courier this morning, Jennifer said, placing a thick manila envelope on my desk. Mr. Blackwood's office confirmed that everything is in order and ready for execution. James Blackwood was my international attorney, a sharp British lawyer who specialized in complex property transfers and corporate restructuring. I'd retained his services a year ago when I'd started planning for the possibility that my marriage might end badly. Thank you, Jennifer. And the other deliveries? The messenger service confirmed that all documents will be delivered by 10 a.m. sharp. Building management has been instructed to require signature confirmation for each delivery. I checked my watch. It was 8:30, which meant David would be getting ready for work, probably still confused about my behavior last night and hoping to smooth things over with flowers or an expensive dinner reservation. He had no idea that in 90 minutes, his entire world was going to implode. Rachel closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair. Emma, I have to ask. How does it feel? After all these years of planning and building this business in secret, how does it feel to finally use it? The question surprised me with its complexity. How did it feel? For so long, our holdings had been my private sanctuary, the one part of my life that David couldn't dismiss or control or take credit for. Building the business had been like building a secret identity, complete with offshore accounts and shell companies and international partnerships that would have impressed even David's most sophisticated clients. It feels like justice, I said. Finally. But also like grief. Because using this power means accepting that my marriage really is over. My phone rang again, and this time it was David's number. I considered letting it go to voicemail, but curiosity got the better of me. Hello, David. Emma, thank God you answered. I've been thinking about our conversation last night, and I realize I didn't handle things well. I want to make this right. Make what right? The 6-month affair or the fact that you're in love with someone else? There was a pause. In the background, I could hear the familiar sounds of David getting ready for work, the electric toothbrush, the coffee maker, the morning news playing on the television. Emma, I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. But throwing away 15 years of marriage without even trying to work through this seems extreme. Extreme. David thought my refusal to ignore his affair was extreme. David, do you remember what you told me on our wedding day? During your vows? Another pause. I remember saying I would love and honor you for better or worse. You also said you would forsake all others. That was actually the traditional language you insisted on using, remember? You thought it sounded more dignified than the modern alternatives. Emma, I made a mistake. A terrible mistake, but still just a mistake. People recover from infidelity all the time. We could go to counseling, take a trip together, figure out how to rebuild what we had. I looked at Rachel, who was making exaggerated gagging motions behind her laptop screen. David, what we had was built on me sacrificing my dreams for yours, me supporting your career while you dismissed mine, me managing your life while you took all the credit. Even if you ended things with Madison today, why would I want to rebuild? That? Because we're good together, Emma. We're a team. We complement each other. No, David. You had an employee who happened to share your bed. That's not the same thing as having a partner. I could hear David moving around the apartment, probably getting dressed for work while he tried to salvage his marriage over the phone. The multitasking was typical. Even during our most serious conversations, David always had one eye on his schedule and his career obligations. Look, I have to get to the office for an 8:30 meeting with the Morrison client. But can we continue this conversation tonight? Maybe over dinner somewhere nice, somewhere we can really talk? I don't think so, David. I think by tonight, you're going to be dealing with some other priorities. What do you mean? I checked my watch again. 8:45. In 15 minutes, David was going to receive the first of several very unpleasant surprises. I mean, I think you should focus on your work today. You're going to need all the billable hours you can get. Emma, you're scaring me. What's going on? Nothing's going on, David. I'm just finally being honest about who I am and what I want. Something you might want to try sometime. I hung up before he could respond and turned back to Rachel. He still doesn't get it, I said. He thinks this is just another problem he can solve with the right words and the right gestures. Well, he's about to get a very expensive education in reality, Rachel replied, checking her own watch. Speaking of which, shouldn't we head over to Sterling and Associates? I want to see the look on Richard Harrison's face when he realizes his landlord is about to evict half his legal team. We gathered our documents and headed for the elevator. The ride down to the parking garage gave me a few minutes to think about what was about to happen. In 1 hour, David would discover that his wife owned his apartment building. Within 2 hours, he'd learn that she also owned the buildings where 4 of his colleagues lived. By noon, he'd realize that his wife's investment hobby was actually a multi-million-dollar real estate empire that made his law firm's salary look like pocket change. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years, David had complained about his clients, who didn't appreciate his legal expertise until they were facing serious legal consequences. Now he was about to experience that same revelation firsthand. Rachel drove while I reviewed the files one more time. Each eviction notice was legally bulletproof, based on legitimate lease violations or policy infractions that had been carefully documented over the past 6 months. The overnight guest policy violations were particularly damning, since David had been flagrantly violating building rules by allowing Madison to stay over regularly without registering her as an authorized resident. "You know what the beautiful part is?" Rachel said as we pulled into the parking garage beneath Sterling and Associates. David always prided himself on reading contracts carefully, on spotting the fine print that other people missed. But he never bothered to read his own lease agreement carefully enough to notice that his landlord was listed as E.R.Th Holdings, not some faceless corporation. We took the elevator up to the 42nd floor, where Sterling and Associates occupied an entire level of one of Chicago's most prestigious office buildings. The reception area was all marble and mahogany, designed to intimidate clients and impress visitors with the firm's success and sophistication. The receptionist, a young woman who looked like she'd been hired for her ability to look professional while saying very little, smiled politely as we approached. "Good morning. Do you have an appointment?" "We're here to see Richard Harrison," I said, placing my business card on her desk. "He called me this morning about an urgent matter." She glanced at the card, and I saw her expression change slightly when she read Emma Richardson, CEO, E.R. Holdings. She probably assumed I was another client with deep pockets and complex legal needs. "Let me check if Mr. Harrison is available." While she made the call, I looked around the reception area, noting the expensive art and the wall of framed awards recognizing the firm's achievements. David's name appeared on several of the plaques, recognition for his work on high-profile corporate mergers and acquisitions. "Mr. Harrison will see you in conference room 3, the receptionist said, gesturing toward a hallway lined with glass-walled offices. As we walked past the offices, I could see David through one of the glass walls, sitting at his desk and talking animatedly on the phone. He was wearing his lucky blue tie, the one he always wore for important client meetings, and his hair was still slightly damp from his morning shower. He looked up as we passed, and I saw his face go through a series of expressions: surprise, confusion, and then something that might have been fear. He'd probably never expected to see me at his office, especially not with Rachel and a briefcase full of legal documents. Richard Harrison was waiting for us in the conference room, a silver-haired man in his early 60s who radiated the kind of authority that came from 40 years of practicing law at the highest levels. He stood as we entered, extending his hand with the practiced charm of someone who'd spent decades managing difficult clients and delicate situations. "Mrs. Carter, thank you for coming in on such short notice. And Miss Martinez, I believe? I understand you work with Mrs. Carter in some capacity?" "Rachel Martinez, legal counsel for E.R.Th Holdings," Rachel said, shaking his hand firmly. "And actually, it's Mrs. Richardson. Mrs. Carter is getting divorced." Richard's carefully maintained composure flickered for just a moment. "I see. Well, please, have a seat. I was hoping we could discuss the situation with David and Miss Wells in a way that might be mutually beneficial for everyone involved." I remained standing, pulling out the first document from my briefcase. "Mr. Harrison, before we discuss anything, I think you should know that I'm not here as David's wife. I'm here as his landlord." The confusion on Richard's face was immediate and complete. "I'm sorry, I don't understand. David Carter is a tenant in one of my properties. As of this morning, he's also a tenant in violation of his lease agreement. I'm here to serve him with an eviction notice." I placed the document on the conference table, watching Richard's face as he processed what I'd just said. He picked up the notice, scanning it quickly, his eyes stopping on the signature line where my name appeared as the property owner. "Mrs. Richardson, I think there's been some mistake. David lives in the Metropolitan Towers, which is owned by a private investment company. E.R. Holdings," I said. "That's my company, Mr. Harrison. I've owned the Metropolitan Towers for 3 years." The silence in the room was profound. Richard looked from the eviction notice to me to Rachel, clearly struggling to understand how David's wife had somehow become his landlord without anyone at the firm knowing about it. "How is that possible?" he asked finally. "It's possible because your associate never bothered to ask his wife what she did with her time when she wasn't managing his social calendar and organizing his dry cleaning," Rachel said. "It's possible because he assumed her business activities were just hobbies that didn't merit his attention." Richard set the document down carefully. "Mrs. Richardson, surely we can resolve this matter without formal eviction proceedings. If there's been a lease violation, perhaps we could address it with a warning or a fine." I pulled out 3 more documents. Mr. Harrison, David Carter isn't the only Sterling and Associates employee who's about to receive an eviction notice. Partners Williams, Chen, and Rodriguez have all been violating the terms of their lease agreements as well. Williams has been subletting his second bedroom without authorization. Chen has been running a consulting business out of his apartment in violation of zoning restrictions, and Rodriguez has been chronically late with rent payments. Richard's face went pale. 4 of his most senior associates lived in buildings I owned, and he was just now learning that their landlord was the estranged wife of one of his rising stars. "What do you want?" he asked quietly. "I want David Carter to understand that actions have consequences," I said. "I want him to realize that the comfortable life he's been taking for granted was built on the work and sacrifice of the woman he's been betraying. And I want him to learn that lesson publicly, in front of the colleagues who are about to discover that their own housing situation depends on the goodwill of the woman they've been treating as just another lawyer's wife at firm parties." Richard stood up, his hands pressed flat against the conference table. "Mrs. Richardson, I understand you're upset about David's personal situation, but using property ownership as a weapon in a divorce seems excessive. Mr. Harrison, using your secretary as a weapon against your marriage seems excessive too, but David didn't let that stop him." I gathered my documents and closed my briefcase. "The eviction notices will be served within the hour. Your associates will have 30 days to vacate their apartments and find new housing. I suggest they start looking immediately, because the Chicago rental market is particularly competitive this time of year." As Rachel and I headed toward the door, Richard called after us. "Mrs. Richardson, wait. Perhaps we could discuss some kind of arrangement. The firm has relationships with several property management companies. Maybe we could work out a deal that would be beneficial for everyone." I paused at the door. "Mr. Harrison, the time for making deals was 6 months ago, when David first started bringing his mistress home to the apartment I provided for him. That ship has sailed." We left Richard Harrison sitting alone in his conference room, probably calculating how much it was going to cost his firm to relocate 4 senior associates on short notice. Through the glass wall, I could see David still at his desk, but now he was standing and talking urgently to someone on the phone, his free hand gesturing wildly. As we waited for the elevator, Rachel grinned. "That went even better than I expected. I don't think Richard Harrison has ever encountered someone who couldn't be bought, threatened, or negotiated with. He's about to learn that there are some problems money can't solve," I said as the elevator doors opened. "At least, not the kind of money he's offering." The elevator descended toward the parking garage, carrying us away from David's world of corporate law and professional prestige. But I knew that in just a few minutes, messengers would be arriving at the Metropolitan Towers and the other buildings in my portfolio, delivering documents that would shatter David's carefully constructed life just as thoroughly as he'd shattered our marriage. And for the first time in months, I felt something I'd almost forgotten: the satisfaction of being in complete control of my own destiny. My phone started ringing before we even reached the parking garage. David's name flashed on the screen, and I could practically feel his panic through the device. I let it ring while Rachel and I climbed into her car, then checked the voicemail he left. "Emma, what the hell is going on? Richard Harrison just told me you own my building and you're trying to evict me. This has to be some kind of mistake. Call me back immediately." The second voicemail came 30 seconds later, his voice higher and more strained. "Emma, I just got a call from Jake in building maintenance. He said there are messengers delivering legal documents to residents all over the building. Whatever game you're playing, this isn't funny anymore. We need to talk right now." Rachel started the car and headed toward Lake Shore Drive, where we could watch the chaos unfold from a safe distance. "He still thinks this is some kind of negotiating tactic," she observed. "Like you're trying to scare him into coming home and apologizing. David's entire worldview is built on the assumption that everyone can be reasoned with, bargained with, or bought off," I replied, watching the third call from him go to voicemail. "He's never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved with the right legal strategy or enough money." My phone buzzed with a text message from Jennifer: "All documents delivered and signed for. Building security reports significant agitation among several residents. Mr. Carter attempted to access building management offices but was informed that all communication must go through legal counsel." I smiled. Jake and his team were clearly enjoying their role in this drama. For years, they'd watched David treat the building staff like invisible servants, never bothering to learn their names or acknowledge their existence beyond demanding immediate service for minor complaints. We parked along the lakefront with a clear view of the Metropolitan Towers, its glass facade gleaming in the morning sun. From this distance, the building looked peaceful and elegant, giving no hint of the turmoil that was undoubtedly erupting inside. "Look," Rachel said, pointing toward the building's main entrance. "There's David." He was standing on the sidewalk. Outside the building, still in his business suit but looking decidedly less polished than usual. His hair was disheveled, his tie was crooked, and he was gesticulating wildly while talking on his phone. Even from a distance, his agitation was obvious. As we watched, a black sedan pulled up to the curb and Madison Wells stepped out. She was wearing a sleek red dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and her confidence was evident in every step as she approached David. "Interesting," Rachel murmured. "Madison's coming to provide moral support, or maybe just to make sure her meal ticket doesn't completely self-destruct." David's body language changed the moment he saw Madison. His shoulders relaxed slightly, and he reached out to touch her arm in a gesture that was both possessive and reassuring. They talked for several minutes, with Madison occasionally glancing up at the building like she was trying to understand the scope of the problem they were facing. My phone rang again, but this time it was a call from my attorney, James Blackwood. "Calling from London. Emma, I trust the documents were delivered on schedule?" "Like clockwork, James. The eviction notices are being served as we speak, and David's law firm is just beginning to understand the scope of their problem." "Excellent. I've prepared the additional documentation we discussed, including the property transfer agreements and the dissolution of joint assets. Everything is ready for your signature whenever you're prepared to move forward." James had been instrumental in structuring my business empire in a way that kept it completely separate from my marriage assets. Every property purchase, every corporate entity, every investment had been carefully designed to ensure that David would have no legal claim on our holdings regardless of how our divorce proceedings unfolded. "What about the international holdings?" I asked. "The properties in London and Dubai are secure, as are the investment accounts in Switzerland. Your husband will discover that his wife's business interests extend considerably beyond Chicago real estate." Through the car window, I could see David and Madison entering the building together, probably hoping to confront building management or demand answers that they weren't going to get. I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. "James, I need you to prepare one more document. I want to make an offer on Sterling and Associates office building." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Emma, that's a $40 million property. Are you certain you want to escalate to that level?" David spent 15 years of our marriage climbing the ladder at that firm, sacrificing our relationship for his career advancement. It seems only fitting that his wife should own the building where he works. Rachel's eyes widened as she listened to my side of the conversation. She'd known about most of my property acquisitions, but the international holdings and the scale of my liquid assets were revelations even to her. "Very well," James said. "I'll have preliminary documents prepared within the hour. The current owners have been struggling with debt service on the property, so they may be motivated to sell quickly." After ending the call, I leaned back in the passenger seat and watched the steady stream of residents entering and leaving the Metropolitan Towers. Most of them were probably unaware of the drama unfolding in the building's upper floors, going about their normal routines while 4 of their neighbors faced sudden homelessness. "Emma, can I ask you something?" Rachel said, her voice carefully neutral. "Of course. How long have you been planning this?" "Because the level of detail, the international components, the legal structures, this isn't something you put together in the past few months." It was a fair question, and one I'd been avoiding asking myself. When exactly had I stopped building a business and started building a weapon? Remember 3 years ago when David forgot our anniversary because he was working on that pharmaceutical merger? He came home at midnight with takeout Chinese food and expected me to be grateful that he'd remembered to bring dinner. Rachel nodded. She'd been the one I'd called that night, crying into a bottle of wine while David worked in his home office, completely oblivious to my disappointment. That was the night I realized that David saw me as a convenience, not a partner. Someone to manage the details of his life so he could focus on the important work of being a successful attorney. I started building our holdings as insurance that night. But you could have just built a business, Emma. You didn't have to. Make it a real estate empire specifically designed to control the living situations of David's colleagues. She was right, of course. I could have started any number of businesses that would have given me financial independence without creating this elaborate web of power over David's professional community. I guess I wanted him to understand what it felt like to have his security depend on someone else's goodwill, I admitted. For 15 years, my emotional security depended entirely on David's commitment to our marriage. I wanted him to experience what it's like when someone you've taken for granted suddenly has complete control over your living situation. My phone buzzed with another call from David. This time I answered. "Emma, I'm standing in the lobby of my building with an eviction notice that says I have 30 days to move out. The building manager says all questions have to be directed to the owner of ER's holdings. Please tell me this is some kind of elaborate joke." "It's not a joke, David. How long have you owned this building? How long have you been lying to me about your business activities? The accusation stung, even though I'd been expecting it. I haven't been lying, David. I've been building a business while you've been building a relationship with your secretary. The difference is that my activities were legal. Emma, this is insane. You can't evict me from my own home just because you're angry about Madison. Actually, I can evict you for violating your lease agreement by having unauthorized overnight guests. Madison Wells has been staying in that apartment regularly for months without being registered as a resident. That's grounds for immediate lease termination under Chicago housing law. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. In the background, I could hear Madison's voice, though I couldn't make out the words. You've been spying on me, David said finally. I've been protecting my investment. The Metropolitan Towers is a $40 million property, David. I have a responsibility to ensure that all residents comply with building policies. 40 million? His voice cracked slightly. Emma, how much money are we talking about here? How big is this business you've been hiding from me? I looked at Rachel, who was listening to the conversation with obvious fascination. Big enough that you'll never be able to afford anything like the Metropolitan Towers on your law firm salary, I said. Big enough that the life you've been taking for granted was actually being subsidized by the wife you've been cheating on. Emma, please. Let's meet somewhere and talk about this rationally. Whatever problems we're having in our marriage, destroying my career isn't going to solve them. Your career? I laughed, and it sounded harsh even to my own ears. David, you're worried about your career? What about my career? What about the business I've been building for the past decade while you assumed I was just playing around? With real estate as a hobby? I never said it was just a hobby. You never said it was anything else, either. You've never asked about my revenue, my expansion plans, my business strategy, or my long-term goals. You've treated my work like an amusing pastime that kept me busy while you focused on the real business of building your legal practice. Through the car window, I could see David and Madison standing in the building's lobby, both of them looking up toward the upper floors like they were trying to understand the magnitude of the problem they were facing. Emma, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I didn't take your business seriously. I'm sorry I didn't ask more questions. I'm sorry about Madison. But please don't destroy my career over this. I'm not destroying your career, David. I'm just no longer subsidizing it. What do you mean? I mean you're about to find out what your life actually costs when you don't have a wealthy wife quietly covering the expenses. The apartment you live in, the car you drive, the designer suits you wear, the expensive dinners you take clients to, where do you think the money for all of that has been coming from? Another long silence. David was a smart man, and I could practically hear him working through the mathematics of our household finances in his head. The joint accounts, he said slowly. The joint accounts that I've been funding for the past 5 years while you spent your entire salary on career advancement and personal expenses. Did you really think a law firm associate's income was enough to support the lifestyle you've been living? I thought we were both contributing to the household expenses. We were. You contributed your legal expertise to help me structure my business acquisitions. I contributed the money that allowed you to live like a successful partner years before you actually made partner. I could see Madison through the building's glass doors, and she was clearly agitated now, gesturing emphatically while talking to David. She was probably beginning to understand that her meal ticket was evaporating in real time. Emma, I need to understand the scope of what we're dealing with here. How many properties do you own? How much is our holdings worth? Enough that you should probably start looking for a less expensive apartment, David. And a less expensive girlfriend. Don't do this, Emma. Don't destroy everything we've built together just because you're angry. Everything we've built together? I felt my carefully maintained composure begin to crack. David, we didn't build anything together. I built a business empire while you built a career and a relationship with another woman. The only thing we built together was a marriage, and you destroyed that all by yourself. I hung up before he could respond and immediately turned off my phone. The conversation had taken more out of me than I'd expected, and I needed a few minutes to collect myself before the next phase of this confrontation. You okay? Rachel asked, reaching over to squeeze my hand. I'm fine. It's just harder than I expected, actually saying all of this out loud. For so many years, I told myself that David's lack of interest in my business was just because he was focused on his own career. But hearing myself explain it just now, I realize how deliberate his ignorance really was. He didn't want to know because then he'd have to acknowledge that his wife was more successful than he was. And he couldn't handle being married to someone who out-earned him, so he just pretended my success didn't exist. We sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the traffic flow along Lake Shore Drive while David and Madison continued Their increasingly animated discussion in the building lobby. Other residents were starting to gather around them, probably comparing eviction notices and trying to understand what was happening to their exclusive residential community. My phone, despite being turned off, somehow managed to buzz with an incoming message. I realized I'd forgotten about my second phone, the one I used exclusively for business calls. The message was from Jennifer. "Mrs. Richardson, you have multiple interview requests from Chicago Tribune, Chicago Sun-Times, and local TV news. Apparently, someone leaked the story about the evictions at the Metropolitan Towers. How would you like me to respond?" I showed the message to Rachel, who whistled low. "Word travels fast in Chicago's legal community," she said. "I bet Richard Harrison is having the worst day of his career right about now." Good. Maybe next time he'll think twice before trying to cover up for one of his associates' extramarital affairs. I typed back to Jennifer, "Schedule interviews for this afternoon. I want to tell this story on my own terms." It was time for Emma Richardson, CEO of E.R. Holdings, to step out of the shadows and claim credit for the business empire she'd built. And it was time for David Carter to learn that the woman he'd been taking for granted was about to become very, very famous. But first, there was one more surprise I wanted to deliver personally. I turned my phone back on and called Jake at the Metropolitan Towers. "Jake, it's Emma. I need you to do me a favor. Can you escort Mr. Carter and his guest to the penthouse conference room? Tell them the building owner wants to meet with them personally to discuss their housing situation." "With pleasure, Mrs. C. Should I mention that the building owner is someone they already know?" "No, let that be a surprise. But Jake? Make sure Madison Wells is with him when they come up. I want both of them to understand exactly what they're dealing with." As I hung up, Rachel started the car and headed back toward downtown. "Ready for the final confrontation?" she asked. "More than ready," I replied, watching the Metropolitan Towers grow larger as we approached. It's time for David to meet his landlord. The penthouse conference room at the Metropolitan Towers was designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Chicago's skyline, while the polished granite table and leather chairs suggested serious money and serious consequences. I'd chosen this room specifically because I wanted David and Madison to understand the scale of what they were dealing with before they even saw me. I arrived 15 minutes early, using my private elevator access to reach the 42nd floor without encountering any residents in the lobby. Jennifer had already arranged the documents I'd need across the conference table like pieces on a chessboard, each one representing another move in a game David was only beginning to understand he was playing. Rachel took her position at the far end of the table with her laptop open, ready to document everything that was about to happen. We'd learned from experience that men like David had selective memories when it came to conversations that didn't go their way. "Are you nervous?" Rachel asked, checking her recording equipment one more time. Surprisingly, no. I feel calm for the first time in months. And it was true. After years of walking on eggshells around David's moods and expectations, after months of pretending I didn't know about his affair, the prospect of finally speaking my truth felt liberating rather than terrifying. My phone buzzed with a text from Jake. "Mr. Carter and Ms. Wells are in the elevator. They both look like they're about to throw up." I straightened my blazer and checked my reflection in the window. The woman looking back at me bore little resemblance to the submissive wife who'd been managing David's social calendar for the past 15 years. This woman wore a tailored suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary, carried herself with the confidence that came from real power, and had eyes that suggested she was done being underestimated. The conference room door opened, and Jake ushered in David and Madison. David looked like he'd aged 5 years in the past 2 hours. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his tie was loosened, and there were stress lines around his eyes that I'd never seen before. Madison, to her credit, still looked polished, but her confidence seemed forced, like she was working hard to maintain her composure. They both stopped dead when they saw me sitting at the head of the conference table. "Hello, David." "Madison." I gestured to the chairs across from me. "Please, sit down. We have a lot to discuss." David's mouth opened and closed several times before any sound came out. "Emma, what is this?" "Jake said the building owner wanted to meet with us." "I am the building owner, David. E.R. Holdings, Richardson Enterprises, Metropolitan Property Management, they're all me. They've always been me." Madison was the first to recover her composure. "Mrs. Carter, I think there's been some misunderstanding. Surely we can resolve this situation without involving property ownership disputes." "It's Mrs. Richardson, actually. And there's no misunderstanding, Madison. You've been sleeping with a married man in an apartment owned by his wife. I'd say that's about as clear-cut as situations get." David finally found his voice. Emma, how long has this been going on? How long have you been building this business behind my back? Not behind your back, David. Right in front of you. I've been attending property management seminars, real estate investment conferences, and business development meetings for years. You just assumed they were hobbies because you never bothered to ask about the details. I slid a folder across the table toward him. These are copies of all the contracts I've signed, all the properties I've acquired, all the business loans I've secured over the past decade. Your signature appears on several of them as my spouse, providing consent for major financial transactions. David opened the folder with shaking hands, his eyes scanning documents that represented millions of dollars in real estate investments he'd apparently authorized without understanding what he was approving. You told me these were just paperwork. For investment accounts, he said weakly. They were investment accounts, David. Real estate investment accounts. The fact that you signed legal documents without reading them carefully is hardly my fault. I thought you were supposed to be good at contract law. Madison leaned forward, her professional instincts finally kicking in. Mrs. Richardson, what exactly do you want from us? Are you looking for some kind of financial settlement? An agreement about discretion? I almost laughed. Even now, facing complete humiliation, Madison was trying to negotiate like this was just another business transaction. What I want, Madison, is for both of you to understand the full scope of the situation you've created. I pressed a button on the conference table's control panel, and a large monitor descended from the ceiling. Rachel, would you mind displaying the portfolio summary? The screen filled with a detailed breakdown of E.R.F. Holdings assets, 37 properties across Chicago, commercial real estate in 3 states, international holdings in London and Dubai, and a cash position that exceeded David's lifetime earnings potential. David stared at the numbers, his face growing paler with each line item. $68 million, he whispered. Emma, you're worth $68 million? We were worth $68 million, David. Past tense. Because as of this morning, I've filed for legal separation and initiated divorce proceedings. My assets will remain mine, and your debts will remain yours. My debts? David's voice cracked. I slid another folder across the table. Your personal credit cards, your law school loans, your car payments, your country club membership. For the past 5 years, all of these have been automatically paid from our joint accounts. Accounts that I've been funding through my business income. Madison was reading over David's shoulder, and I watched her face change as she realized the implications. David, how much do you actually earn at the law firm? After taxes and retirement contributions, about $8,000 a month, David admitted quietly. And how much do you spend on rent, car payments, and personal expenses? David looked at the documents Rachel had prepared, detailing his monthly expenditures. About $12,000 a month, he said, his voice barely audible. The math was brutal and undeniable. For years, David had been living a lifestyle he couldn't afford, subsidized by a wife whose business success he dismissed as a hobby. Now that subsidy was about to disappear, and he was going to discover what his life actually cost. Madison, I said, turning my attention to the woman who'd helped destroy my marriage, I assume you were attracted to David's apparent wealth and success. The expensive dinners, the luxury apartment, the designer clothes, it all painted a picture of a man who had his life together, didn't it? Madison's perfect composure finally cracked. This isn't fair. You let him believe he was successful. You let him live like he was wealthy. You created this situation. I created a marriage where I supported my husband's career and lifestyle. Because I loved him and believed we were building a future together. David created a situation where he took my support for granted while pursuing a relationship with another woman. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city where I'd built my empire while my husband built his affair. The irony is that David could have had everything legitimately. If he'd been a real partner in our marriage, if he'd supported my business the way I supported his career, we could have built something incredible together. Emma, it's not too late, David said desperately. I can end things with Madison right now. We can go to counseling, take a vacation, start over. I turned back to face him. David, do you remember what you said to me last night? About not knowing if you loved me or if our relationship was just habit. He nodded miserably. That was the first honest thing you'd said to me in years. And the truth is, I don't know if I love you anymore either. I know I love the man I married, but that man wouldn't have spent 6 months lying to my face while sleeping with his secretary. Madison stood up abruptly. This is ridiculous. You can't destroy someone's life. Just because you're jealous. Jealous? I looked at her with genuine surprise. Madison, why would I be jealous of you? You're about to be involved with a man who's facing eviction, who can't afford his current lifestyle without his wife's financial support, and who has a demonstrated history of infidelity. If anything, I feel sorry for you. David is a successful attorney with a bright future, Madison said, but her voice lacked conviction. David is a 42-year-old associate at a law firm where making partner requires political skills he clearly doesn't possess, given that he thought having an affair with his secretary was a good career move. I returned to my seat at the head of the table, picking up one final document. Which brings me to my last surprise. Rachel, would you mind explaining the Sterling and Associates situation? Rachel cleared her throat. As of this morning, E.R. Holdings has made a formal offer to purchase the building that houses Sterling and Associates. The current owners are experiencing financial difficulties and are motivated to sell quickly. David's face went completely white. You're buying my office building? I'm considering it. The property is undervalued, and I think there's significant potential for improvement. Of course, any new ownership would likely want to review the lease agreements for all tenants, including law firms that might not be meeting their professional obligations. You can't do this, Emma. This is my career, my livelihood. David, you made a choice to prioritize your relationship with Madison over your marriage to me. Now I'm making a choice to prioritize my business interests over your career comfort. It's really that simple. Madison grabbed her purse and prepared to leave, but I held up my hand. Actually, Madison, before you go, I think you should understand what you're walking into. David, show her the real numbers. I pulled out a comprehensive financial statement that Rachel had prepared, detailing David's actual financial position. The color drained from Madison's face as she read through the documentation. Your boyfriend earns $96,000 a year before taxes, I continued. After taxes, insurance, and mandatory retirement contributions, he takes home about $72,000. His current monthly expenses, including the car lease, country club membership, dry cleaning, dining out, and personal shopping, total approximately $14,000 per month. That's a deficit of almost $6,000 monthly that has been covered by his wife's business income. Madison looked at David like she was seeing him for the first time. You told me you were making partner soon. You said the money would never be an issue. I am going to make partner, David said weakly, but even he seemed to realize how hollow the words sounded. David, I said gently, you've been an associate for 8 years. The average timeline for making partner at Sterling and Associates is 12 years, and that's for attorneys who don't have ethics violations on their record. Your relationship with Madison is going to trigger a formal investigation, which will delay any partnership consideration indefinitely. I opened another folder, this one containing internal Sterling and Associates documents that I'd obtained through perfectly legal channels. Moreover, the firm's financial performance has been declining for 3 years. They've postponed partnership decisions twice in the past 18 months, and they're currently carrying more associates than they can afford to promote. Madison was still staring at the financial statements, her face pale. David, how did you afford that trip to Napa last month? The one where you said money was no object? David's shoulders sagged. Emma transferred money to our joint account the week before. She always made sure there was enough for everything. The silence in the room was deafening. Madison slowly sat back down, her designer handbag clutched in her lap like a life preserver. So when David told you he could take care of you financially, I said to Madison, he was essentially promising to spend his wife's money on his mistress. I hope you find that as romantic as it sounds. This is insane, Madison whispered. You people are both insane. Actually, Madison, I think the situation is remarkably sane. David wanted to have an affair, so he did. I want to stop funding his lifestyle, so I am. You want to be with a successful man who can provide financial security, so you're about to discover whether David fits that description when he's living on his actual income. I stood up and walked around the table, stopping directly in front of Madison. Let me ask you something. When David takes you to dinner now, are you going to be comfortable knowing that every expensive meal is putting him deeper into debt? When he buys you gifts, will you enjoy them knowing he can't afford them? When you spend weekends in his apartment, will you be able to relax knowing that he's facing eviction? Madison's carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the fact that she was beginning to panic. David, tell her this is temporary. Tell her you have options. David looked up at me with something that might have been hope. Emma, I could take a position with another firm. Start over somewhere that doesn't know about this situation. With what references, David? Richard Harrison isn't going to recommend you after this scandal. Your other colleagues at Sterling and Associates are about to discover that their housing situation depends on the goodwill of the woman you cheated on. Who exactly is going to vouch for your character and professionalism? I returned to my seat and opened the final folder, the one I'd been saving for last. But let's say you do find another position. Let's say some firm is willing to hire you. Despite the circumstances of your departure from Sterling and Associates. Do you know what entry-level associates earn at smaller firms, David? I slid the salary survey across the table. $60,000 to $70,000 per year. Before taxes. You'd be starting over financially as well as professionally, earning less than you made as a first-year associate 15 years ago. Madison was now reading the salary information with obvious horror. That's not even enough for rent on a decent apartment in Chicago. Exactly, I said. Which brings us to the most important question of all. Madison, are you prepared to date a man who lives in a studio apartment in Cicero and takes you to dinner at Applebee's because that's what he can afford? The question hung in the air like smoke. Madison looked at David, then at the financial documents, then back at David. The calculation happening behind her eyes was almost visible. David, she said slowly, maybe we should take a break while you get your situation sorted out. Madison, you can't be serious. This is just a temporary setback. Once I find a new position, once things settle down. David, I have my own career to think about. I can't be associated with this kind of scandal indefinitely. I watched their relationship disintegrate in real time, both of them finally understanding that their attraction had been built on financial illusions rather than genuine affection. Madison had wanted a successful man who could provide security and status. David had wanted a young woman who made him feel powerful and desirable. Neither of them had wanted the other person, they'd wanted what that person represented. Madison, I said quietly, you should know that word of this situation is already spreading through Chicago's legal community. Your name is going to be associated with this scandal regardless of what you do now. Her face went even paler. What do you mean? I mean that Richard Harrison has probably spent the morning calling his contacts at other firms, warning them about that situation. At Sterling and Associates. Your professional reputation is going to be affected whether you stay with David or not. Madison grabbed her phone and quickly typed something, her fingers moving frantically across the screen. Within seconds, her phone started buzzing with responses. 3 firms have already pulled my job applications, she said, her voice hollow. 3 firms I interviewed with last week. The legal community in Chicago is smaller than most people realize, I said, not unsympathetically. Reputations travel fast, and they travel far. David reached across the table toward Madison. We can get through this together. We can move to another city, start fresh somewhere else. Madison pulled her hand away. David, I worked too hard to get where I am to throw it all away for a relationship that's been based on lies from the beginning. They weren't lies, Madison. I love you. You love the fantasy version of yourself that you created with your wife's money. The real you, the one sitting in this room right now, is someone I don't even recognize. Madison stood up and walked toward the door, then paused and looked back at me. Mrs. Richardson, I want you to know that I never intended for things to go this far. I thought David was separated, at first. When I realized he wasn't, I should have ended it. But you didn't end it, Madison. You chose to continue the relationship for 6 months while watching him lie to his wife. You chose to participate in deceiving a woman who had never done anything to hurt you. Madison nodded slowly. You're right. I made terrible choices. And now I have to live with the consequences. She left without saying goodbye to David, her heels clicking across the marble floor with sharp, final sounds. David and I sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of 15 years of marriage settling between us like dust after an explosion. He looked older than I'd ever seen him, worn down by the realization that his comfortable life had been built on foundations he'd never bothered to examine. She's really gone, he said finally. Yes, she is. And honestly, David, that's probably the best thing that could happen to both of you. Your relationship was built on false pretenses and maintained through deception. It never would have survived. Reality. What about us, Emma? Is there any possibility that we could work through this? I looked at the man I'd once loved enough to sacrifice my own dreams for, and felt nothing but sadness for what we'd both lost. David, I want you to think about something. For the past 6 months, you've been living 2 completely different lives. During the day, you were the successful attorney with the beautiful secretary, dining at expensive restaurants and feeling like the man you always wanted to be. At night, you came home to a wife who managed your household, paid your bills, and asked no questions about where you'd been. David's face crumpled as the full weight of his choices hit him. You weren't choosing Madison over me, David. You were choosing a fantasy over reality. The fantasy that you were self-sufficient, successful, and desirable enough to attract a younger woman. The reality is that you're a middle-aged man who's been living beyond his means while his wife built a business empire he was too self-absorbed to notice. I gathered my documents and prepared to leave. The man I married had Integrity, ambition, and dreams about making the world a better place. That man wouldn't have needed to create elaborate fantasies to feel good about himself. I can be that man again, Emma. I can change. Maybe you can, David. But you'll have to do it without me, and you'll have to do it with your own resources. The days of me subsidizing your self-improvement are over. I walked toward the door, then paused. Your personal belongings can remain in the apartment until the end of the month. After that, anything left behind will be donated to charity. Where will you go? David asked. I have a penthouse apartment in the River North building I bought last year. It has a beautiful view of the city and space for the art studio I've always wanted. I paused at the door. David, for what it's worth, I hope you find happiness. Real happiness, based on honest relationships and authentic success. But you're going to have to build that for yourself. As I left David sitting alone in the conference room, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete freedom. The weight of maintaining a marriage built on lies and compromises was finally lifting, replaced by the lightness that came from living authentically. Rachel was waiting by the elevator, grinning broadly. So, how does it feel to be the most powerful woman in Chicago real estate? It feels like the beginning of something new, I said as the elevator doors closed behind us. For the first time in 15 years, I get to live my life on my own terms. The following weeks brought a flurry of activity that kept me too busy to dwell on the end of my marriage. The Sterling and Associates building purchase went through exactly as planned, giving me ownership of the property that housed David's former employer. The law firm's lease was up for renewal in 6 months, and I intended to use that timeframe to implement some significant changes to the building's operations. Richard Harrison requested a meeting with me 3 days after David's eviction notice was served. He arrived at my River North penthouse looking significantly less confident than he had in his own conference room. Mrs. Richardson, he began, settling into the leather chair across from my desk, I think we may have gotten off on the wrong foot. I'm hoping we can find a way to resolve this situation that works for everyone involved. What kind of resolution did you have in mind, Mr. Harrison? Well, I understand that you're upset about David's personal situation, and rightfully so. But Sterling and Associates has been a good tenant in that building for over 20 years. I'd hate to see a personal matter affect our business relationship. I leaned back in my chair, studying the man who had spent the morning after David's affair was exposed trying to minimize the scandal rather than address the ethical implications. Mr. Harrison, let me ask you something. How long have you known about David's relationship with Madison Wells? Richard shifted uncomfortably. I had suspicions for the past few weeks, but I didn't have concrete evidence until yesterday. Suspicions that you chose not to investigate or address. Mrs. Richardson, what happens between consenting adults outside the office is generally not the firm's business, unless it affects their professional performance. Madison Wells is David's subordinate employee. Their relationship creates liability issues for your firm, exposes you to potential harassment lawsuits from other female employees, and violates the ethical guidelines that govern attorney conduct. Are you telling me that Sterling and Associates has no policies regarding relationships between supervisors and subordinates? Richard's silence was answer enough. Mr. Harrison, I think you misunderstood my motivation for purchasing your building. This isn't about punishing Sterling and Associates for David's behavior. It's about ensuring that properties in my portfolio are occupied by tenants who maintain professional standards consistent with the building's reputation. I slid a folder across my desk toward him. These are the new building policies that will go into effect when your lease comes up for renewal. All tenants will be required to maintain liability insurance that specifically covers workplace harassment claims. All tenants will be required to submit annual certifications that they are in compliance with relevant professional ethical guidelines. And all tenants will be subject to immediate lease termination if they are found to be operating in violation of those professional standards. Richard opened the folder and read through the new requirements, his face growing more concerned. With each page, Mrs. Richardson, these requirements are significantly more stringent than typical commercial lease agreements. Yes, they are. I'm positioning this property as premium office space for firms that maintain the highest professional standards. Firms that meet those standards will find the building an excellent environment for their practice. Firms that don't meet those standards will need to find space elsewhere. And if Sterling and Associates chooses not to renew under these terms, then you'll have 6 months to find alternative office space. I'm sure there are other buildings in Chicago that would be happy to accommodate a firm with more flexible ethical standards. Richard closed the folder and sat back in his chair. Mrs. Richardson, I think I understand your position. What would you need to see from Sterling and Associates to demonstrate that we take these professional standards seriously? Full implementation. of harassment prevention policies, including mandatory training for all employees, clear guidelines prohibiting romantic relationships between supervisors and subordinates, and the resignation of any employees who are currently in violation of those policies. You're asking me to fire David Carter. I'm asking you to enforce professional standards that should have been in place all along. What you do with David Carter is your decision. Richard left my office with a lot to think about, and I suspect he spent the rest of the day calculating whether keeping David was worth losing their prestigious office location. Meanwhile, David was discovering what his life looked like without my financial support. He'd found a one-bedroom apartment in a less expensive neighborhood, driving a used Honda instead of his leased BMW, and eating lunch at his desk instead of taking clients to expensive restaurants. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he was working longer hours and taking on more cases, trying to increase his billable hours to make up for his reduced income. It was, ironically, probably the best thing that could have happened to his career development, even if he was too proud to see it that way. Madison Wells had taken a position with a smaller firm specializing in family law, a significant step down from her previous role at Sterling & Associates. The salary reduction was substantial, and she'd moved from her luxury apartment to a modest place in Lincoln Park. I felt no satisfaction in their struggles, but I also felt no guilt. Both of them had made choices with full knowledge that their actions would hurt people they claimed to care about. The consequences they were experiencing were the natural result of those choices, not punishments I had imposed. 3 months after our confrontation in the conference room, I received an unexpected call from David. "Emma, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I wanted to tell you something." "What is it, David?" "I've been going to therapy. Individual therapy, not couples counseling. Dr. Martinez has been helping me understand some things about myself that I never wanted to acknowledge." I waited for him to continue. "I think I've been using other people to avoid dealing with my own insecurities for most of my adult life. First with you, letting you handle all the practical aspects of our life so I could focus on feeling successful. Then with Madison, using her attention to convince myself I was still young and desirable. That's a difficult realization to come to. Dr. Martinez says I've been treating relationships like business transactions, expecting to get something in return for my investment instead of valuing the other person for who they are." I was surprised by the depth of his self-reflection. The David I'd been married to had rarely acknowledged personal flaws, let alone analyzed their psychological origins. "How are you doing, financially and professionally?" "It's been an adjustment. I'm earning less money, but I'm working harder and doing better legal work than I have in years. When you're not taking your income for granted, you pay more attention to earning it." "And Madison?" "We haven't spoken since that day in your conference room. I think we both realized that our relationship was built on things that weren't real." We talked for another few minutes, carefully avoiding the subject of reconciliation or forgiveness. David was clearly in a different emotional place than he'd been 3 months earlier, but I wasn't ready to explore what that might mean for either of us. After hanging up, I realized that I felt something I hadn't expected: pride in David's willingness to do the difficult work of honest self-examination. It didn't change what had happened between us, but it suggested that he might eventually become the kind of person who could have healthy relationships. 6 months after David's eviction from the Metropolitan Towers, I was featured on the cover of Chicago Business Journal as Real Estate Mogul of the Year. The article detailed how a mysterious property investor had quietly built one of the city's most successful real estate empires while maintaining a public profile as a lawyer's wife. The interview process had been fascinating, particularly when the reporter asked about the challenges of building a business while married. The biggest challenge, I'd told her, was learning to value my own achievements even when the people closest to me didn't understand or appreciate them. Success that depends on external validation is fragile. Success that comes from internal satisfaction and authentic accomplishment is permanent. The article generated significant media attention, including interview requests from several national publications interested in stories about female entrepreneurs who had built businesses while managing traditional domestic responsibilities. I accepted some of the interviews, partly because I wanted to inspire other women who might be hiding their ambitions to avoid threatening insecure partners, and partly because I wanted to demonstrate that financial independence was possible, even within marriages that seemed to limit women's opportunities. David never did make partner at Sterling & Associates. The ethics investigation, combined with the firm's embarrassment over the whole situation, effectively ended his chances for advancement. He eventually took a position with a smaller firm at a significantly reduced salary and seemed to be building a more sustainable and authentic career. Richard Harrison chose to implement the new building policies rather than relocate Sterling & Associates. The firm invested heavily in harassment prevention training and revised their employment policies to prohibit romantic relationships between supervisors and subordinates. 3 other attorneys left the firm rather than comply with the new ethical requirements, suggesting that David's situation had not been an isolated incident. Madison Wells found a new position at a different firm, though her reputation for aggressive networking followed her. She never did find another boyfriend with David's apparent lifestyle, primarily because she now understood the difference between actual wealth and subsidized comfort. As for me, I expanded Arth Holdings into commercial development and sustainable housing projects. I endowed a scholarship fund for women in real estate and started mentoring other female entrepreneurs who wanted to build businesses without sacrificing their identities. The penthouse apartment in River North had become everything I'd dreamed it could be. The art studio overlooked the city, filled with natural light and canvases that reflected my growing confidence in expressing myself creatively. The home office was a command center for an expanding business empire that now included properties in 4 states and 2 countries. Most importantly, it was a space that belonged entirely to me, decorated according to my preferences and organized around my priorities rather than someone else's expectations. I dated occasionally, but I was in no hurry to remarry or cohabitate. For the first time in my adult life, I was discovering who I was when I wasn't trying to be what someone else needed me to be. A year after our divorce was finalized, David sent me a letter that I read while sitting in my art studio, watching the sunset paint the Chicago skyline in shades of gold and crimson. "Emma," he wrote, "I know you may not want to hear from me, but I wanted you to know that I understand now what I lost when I destroyed our marriage. I didn't just lose a wife, I lost a partner who was more talented, more successful, and more generous than I was mature enough to appreciate." He went on to tell me about his new position at a public interest law firm, work that paid significantly less than his corporate practice but aligned with the values he claimed to have when we first met. He was living in a modest apartment and driving a used car, but he sounded happier and more authentic than he had in years. "I don't expect forgiveness," the letter concluded, "and I'm not asking for a second chance. I just wanted you to know that losing you taught me the difference between having someone and appreciating them. I hope the man you end up with is wise enough to see your worth from the beginning." I folded the letter and put it in my desk drawer, not because I was considering reconciliation, but because it represented something important, proof that people could change, even when the consequences of their actions couldn't be undone. Sometimes, late at night in my penthouse apartment, I wondered if things could have been different if David had truly seen me as an equal partner. But then I'd look out at the city lights and remember that the woman who'd built this empire had always been inside me, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The best revenge, I'd learned, wasn't destroying someone else's life. It was building your own life so successfully that their opinion of you became irrelevant. And every month, when David's rent check for his modest apartment cleared his account on schedule, I was reminded that actions really do have consequences, and sometimes those consequences arrive with compound interest. But more importantly, I was reminded that the most powerful thing a woman can do is refuse to make herself smaller to accommodate someone else's insecurity. The girl who had once rearranged her dreams to fit into David's vision of success had become a woman who created her own definition of achievement. And that woman was worth more than any marriage built on compromise and self-denial could ever have been. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.